The Orion Capsule's fiery return. Extreme engineering explained. Imagine falling from the moon, not floating, not gliding, falling at 40,000 kilometers per hour, encased in a metal shell the size of a minivan, wrapped in a shroud of superheated plasma hotter than the surface of the sun. There is no abort button, there is no second attempt, and for 7 full minutes, no one on Earth can even hear your voice. This is what it takes to come home from the moon, and it is, without question, the most violent and precisely engineered event in all of human spaceflight. 4 astronauts, 1 capsule, and a window of entry so narrow that missing it by even a fraction of a degree means burning up or skipping off the atmosphere into the void of space, never to return. The margin between triumph and catastrophe is measured not in kilometers, but in millimeters, not in minutes, but in milliseconds. This is the story of the engineering that makes survival possible. It begins not with fire, but with silence. At approximately 5,000 kilometers above Earth's surface, a series of pyrotechnic bolts detonate, and the Orion capsule separates from its European Service Module, the ESM, a powerhouse of propulsion and life support built by the European Space Agency that has sustained the crew throughout their lunar journey. The ESM has done its job. Now it dies for them. Tumbling away, it will disintegrate in the upper atmosphere within minutes, never reaching the ground. Orion continues alone. From this moment, every system aboard is running on internal power. Every decision is pre-programmed or made by the crew. There is no calling back for new instructions. The path is set, and that path is terrifying. To understand what Orion faces, you need to understand the difference between a trip from low Earth orbit and a trip from the moon. When a Crew Dragon capsule returns from the International Space Station, it re-enters the atmosphere at roughly 28,000 kilometers per hour. That alone generates temperatures approaching 2,000 degrees Celsius and demands extraordinary thermal protection. Orion arrives from 385,000 kilometers away, traveling at nearly 11 kilometers per second. That's 40,000 kilometers per hour. The kinetic energy contained in that moving mass is not just bigger than a Crew Dragon's, it is nearly double. And because kinetic energy scales with the square of velocity, that extra 12,000 kilometers per hour doesn't add a little more heat, it adds an entirely different category of punishment. Every single joule of that energy must be neutralized before 4 human beings step out onto a recovery ship. The question engineers had to answer was deceptively simple. Where does all of it go? The answer they arrived at is one of the most elegant solutions in aerospace engineering, and it draws on a principle any child instinctively understands. When you skip a flat stone across a lake, it doesn't sink immediately. It grazes the surface, bounces, grazes again, and eventually comes to rest. NASA engineers looked at that concept and built a re-entry trajectory around it. Instead of diving nose first into the dense lower atmosphere, which would generate catastrophic G-forces and a single intense thermal spike, Orion skims the upper atmospheric layers at a shallow angle. It slows slightly, it absorbs some heat. Then, before it plunges deeper, it bounces back up into near space for a brief moment before descending again on a second pass. This technique, called skip re-entry, accomplishes 2 extraordinary things simultaneously. First, it spreads the deceleration across a longer arc of time, reducing the peak G-forces experienced by the crew from potentially lethal levels to something the human body can survive, roughly 4 Gs, comparable to a sharp roller coaster. Second, it gives mission controllers far greater precision in directing the capsule toward a specific splashdown zone in the Pacific Ocean. Without skip re-entry, the landing footprint would be enormous and largely unpredictable. With it, they can thread the capsule through a window precise enough to have a recovery ship waiting. The geometry of this maneuver must be calculated perfectly before re-entry begins. Orion cannot adjust on the fly. It's a ballistic equation solved in advance and then executed at 40,000 kilometers per hour with no margin for improvisation. At the base of Orion sits the most critical piece of hardware in the entire mission, a heat shield 5 meters in diameter, coated in a material called AVCOAT. To To call it fireproof would be an understatement. AVCOAT doesn't resist heat, it consumes itself to absorb it. It's an ablative compound, a honeycomb structure of fiberglass cells filled with a specially formulated resin. As the plasma builds against the shield's surface and temperatures climb past 2,800 degrees Celsius, a figure that represents roughly half the temperature at the visible surface of the sun, the AVCOAT doesn't melt or crack, it sublimates. It transforms directly from solid to gas, and as it does, it carries the thermal energy away from the capsule in the form of superheated vapor. Layer by microscopic layer, it burns so the astronauts don't have to. Behind that ablating surface sits an aluminum structure that must remain below 200 degrees Celsius throughout the entire re-entry sequence. The AVCOAT is the only thing standing between that requirement and 2,800 degrees of plasma. It has a thickness measured in centimeters. The engineering tolerance is razor thin, and there is no backup. Then something happens that no amount of engineering can prevent. As Orion plows through the atmosphere at hypersonic velocity, the violence of compression doesn't just heat the air, it fundamentally transforms it. Electrons are ripped from their atoms. The air becomes plasma, an electrically charged gas that is, among other things, completely opaque to radio waves. Every frequency Houston uses to communicate with the capsule is absorbed instantly. The crew cannot transmit, mission control cannot receive, telemetry flatlines, voice contact vanishes. For approximately 7 minutes that feel to everyone in that control room like the longest of their lives, the Orion capsule simply disappears. The astronauts inside know this is coming. They've trained for it, but training for silence and living through it are different things. Hurtling through a plasma fireball at 11 kilometers per second, unable to speak to another human being, with nothing to do but wait and trust, that is a particular kind of courage that no simulation can fully replicate. When the signal returns, the sound of static breaking into a clear voice is, by every account for mission control veterans, one of the most emotionally overwhelming moments in spaceflight. Artemis II launched in November 2022 and was, by nearly every measure, a resounding success. Orion flew around the moon, executed its trajectory flawlessly, and splashed down safely in the Pacific. But when engineers examined the heat shield up close, they found something they hadn't expected. The AVCOAT had not just ablated in the intended, controlled manner. In certain areas, small chunks of material had broken away, a phenomenon called spalling, in patterns that the thermal models had not predicted. On an uncrewed mission, this was a data point. On a crewed mission, it's a potential death sentence. If spalling occurs in the wrong location, it can expose underlying material to plasma temperatures it was never designed to handle. It can compromise the structural integrity of the shield in ways that cascade unpredictably. Engineers have spent months stress-testing hypotheses, analyzing every frame of flight data, and attempting to reproduce the conditions in ground-based facilities. Artemis II carries 4 human beings. Before they climb aboard, that mystery must be resolved. Not partially understood, not statistically acceptable, resolved completely. Because in this context, probably fine is not an engineering standard. It's a gamble with lives. At 7,000 meters altitude, the plasma is gone, the fireball has dissipated, the heat shield has done its job, and Orion is now an aluminum capsule falling toward the Pacific Ocean at 500 kilometers per hour. That is still fast enough to kill everyone aboard on impact. This is where the most intricate parachute system ever designed for a crewed spacecraft takes over. 11 parachutes in total, each with a specific role, deployed in a precisely timed sequence that leaves no room for error. First come 2 drogue chutes, each 7 meters across, that extract from the capsule and immediately begin to stabilize it. Orion has been tumbling and oscillating through re-entry. Without stabilization, the main parachutes could tangle, deploy asymmetrically, or fail to open cleanly. The drogues don't slow the capsule much, they simply bring order to chaos. Next, 3 pilot chutes, small, fast, forceful, are released. Their only purpose is mechanical. They yank the 3 main parachutes out of their storage compartments with enough force to guarantee deployment even if the capsule is still moving erratically. Then, the mains open. 3 enormous canopies, red and white, each one wide enough to cover a football pitch. They billow out above the capsule, and the deceleration is dramatic and sudden. 500 kilometers per hour bleeds down, 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 to a final descent speed of approximately 30 kilometers per hour. That's a brisk jogging pace, enough to feel on impact, gentle enough to survive. The capsule strikes the Pacific Ocean. To those watching from the recovery ship, it's a spectacular sight. A fireball that becomes a set of parachutes, that becomes a spacecraft floating on water in a matter of minutes. For the astronauts inside, it is the most welcome jolt they've ever felt. Within seconds of impact, 5 inflatable balloons mounted at the top of the capsule deploy automatically. They fill with gas and lever the capsule upright, ensuring Orion sits